Hey everybody, thanks for joining me and Michael and Beth. Today we are going to talk about what's next, the future of Node.js. I'll quickly just say thanks to our hosts and our sponsors and everybody speaking. Great event so far, but for the sake of time, let's just jump into intros. My name is Joe Sepi. I am an open source engineer and advocate at IBM. I'm the cross-project council chairperson at the OpenJS Foundation and a voting rep for Node.js, and I'm active in the Node.js community as well. Michael?
Hi, I'm Michael Dawson, the Node.js lead for Red Hat and IBM. What that means is I get to work with a great number of teams within Red Hat and IBM who are deploying Node.js at scale, helping to work in the community, and sort of using Node in all different areas. But it also means I get to be really active in the community, which is great. I'm a collaborator, member of the technical steering committee and community committees, as well as participating in a good number of them. I also work with Joe in the OpenJS Foundation as a cross-project council member, and I'm currently acting as the community director for 2020-2021. Over to Beth.
Hi everyone, my name is Beth Griggs and I'm a senior software engineer at Red Hat, recently moved over from IBM, and I'm also quite active in the Node community, so I'm a technical steering committee member, but most of my focus is around the release working group. When I'm not working on things related to Node Core, I'm working on things at Red Hat like development tooling for OpenShift and helping to build out the reference architecture that was mentioned earlier. And what are we going to talk about today? Well, first we're going to go through how you can track what's next, so how you can follow what's going on in the Node project at the core level. Introduce some of our strategic initiatives and working groups, in particular the Next 10 effort that's recently been kicked off, recap where we are with releases, and then touch upon some new and experimental features. And towards the end, Joe, I'll tell you how you can get involved with Node Core and the OpenJS. So you may be surprised to learn that the Node project doesn't actually have a formal roadmap. There's no prioritized task list, there's no single corporate sponsor. The project's completely decentralized. And generally, what makes it into the runtime is the features and changes that interest and represent requirements of the contributors that are willing to go to the effort to create these. And so what's it like not having a roadmap? Well, I spent a short while trying to come up with a good analogy recently, and I thought this one was quite appropriate. So this is a famous roundabout or turning circle in the UK, and it's actually quite complicated to navigate. There's like 5 miniature roundabouts all in a circle. And as you can see, it handles a heavy flow of traffic, heading in all different directions. Some cars are heading in the same direction, some are not, and occasionally the cars cross paths and there are holdups. And I think that somewhat represents feature development and what's going on in the Node Core. There's a very high flow of traffic and activity. Some folks are working on similar things and other people are just working on their distinct areas of the project. And inevitably, sometimes things get held up, be that we need to come for technical reasons, or maybe we need to come to consensus on some implementation details. So with the roadmap, not having a roadmap, how can you find out what's in the pipeline? There are a few ways you can try and keep track of what's happening in the project. So the project has a Medium blog, which is nodejsmedium.com. Twitter is another good way. A number of the Node.js contributors are active on Twitter, many at this event today. So following those is another good way. Or you could follow our GitHub and subscribe to GitHub notifications. But about the GitHub notifications, if you subscribe to Core and some of the other repositories, there will be a lot of activity. It's hard to keep up. Couple of hundred notifications a day at least, and admittedly myself, every week I just click rebel and start again because it's just too difficult to keep up. So rather than following the massive notifications, there are some efforts you can follow in particular. So despite not having a roadmap, there are still longer term efforts and planning. And these are, one way these are organized are into working groups and teams. And these both act as kind of task forces for pushing forward certain areas of certain subject areas. For example, in the past, we had like the modules effort, and we got diagnostics, focused on defining diagnostics best practices. And there is a slight difference between a working group and a team. A working group has is chartered and has delegated responsibilities, so they really own that area of the project, whereas a team is more a group of folks who are interested in this area getting together. And as a short note, if you are looking to get involved with the project, one of the good ways is to look at these working groups and teams, if any align with your interests. Following what their activity specifically is a good way to start getting involved. So as well as working groups and teams, the Node project also has what we call strategic initiatives. And they are really just agreed initiatives that the project hopes to make progress on. Again, there's not really a priority list or deadline associated with any of these. These are just some important goals that we think it'd be useful for us to track over time and report the status on, and figure out ways maybe we can help push them forwards or enable their success. And at the moment, under the technical steering committee, we have a few technical initiatives, including promissifying the core APIs, V8 currency, quick and HTTP-free, improving startup performance, build resources, so that's around the infrastructure that we use to get releases out to our users, and the future of the build toolchain. And each one of these has a champion for the areas. As well as the technical strategic initiatives, we also have the community initiatives, and these fall under our community committee, and they include things like internationalization, mentorship, and outreach, and the website redesign effort. And again, these are other areas to look if you're looking to get involved with the project. And another recent effort that's been kicked off is the Next 10 team.
Right. So the Next 10 is an effort to look at, the success that Node had, and everybody I think agrees that the first 10 years of Node.js were a great success, and to figure out how we build on that to make the next 10 years just as successful or even more successful. We started by thinking and talking a bit about like different technologies like WASM or TypeScript, and what would be important to bring into Node to make it successful. But what we quickly realized is we needed more of a foundation in terms of a better understanding and documentation of the technical values of the project, the constituencies, so the different groups that use Node.js, and what the needs were of those constituencies. So we'd sort of have a foundation to look at each of those technologies and to have a discussion and sort of discuss how they related to those needs before we could get started. So that's what we focused on in our initial meetings. We actually have a good set that we've identified so far in terms of the values and the priority levels, the constituencies and their needs. You can come and join us in the Next 10 repo to join into the effort. But one of the other things you can do is to help us make sure we've got the foundation right. We currently have a survey out. The link is out there, asking if you feel you're in one of the constituencies and what your needs are, so that we can make sure that we have a strong foundation for when we dive back into the technical discussions, which we've already done. So if you're interested, please come and join us in starting to talk about the technologies. But please fill out the survey. If you need more background, you can go and read about it in the Medium blog post that's pasted there. And we hope to see you as part of the effort. Back to Beth.
Yeah, so we're going through a couple of ways in the efforts to keep up with the projects, but typically for most of our users, they'll only find out about the new changes or new features when they actually get shipped into a release. So there's actually a distinct flow that you can expect changes and new features to arrive in the various Node.js release lines. So we aim to have a very predictable release schedule. We have 2 majors per year, where the even-numbered release lines are promoted to long-term support. And within that schedule, we actually have 3 defined release phases. And it's during the current phase where the release line will pick up most of the non-breaking and non-major changes that land on the core main branch. And it's during active LTS, it's only the new features, bug fixes, and updates that have been out there in the current release and then have been audited by the long-term support team to be determined to be appropriate and stable before they get pulled back. And then we have maintenance. So in the maintenance phase, this tends to be restricted to critical bug fixes and security updates, but very rarely we will make the decision to add new features to these release lines, typically in the case where bringing that feature back will support people moving up the release lines. So really, you can expect the newest features and updates to get in your hands quickest if you're using the current release line, which at the moment is Node.js 15. And you can typically expect a release every 2 weeks for the current release line. So every 2 weeks, we pick up the patches and features that land on the core main branch and ship them out in a release. After some time, some of those may get pulled back to the long-term support release lines, but not all of them. Some will be considered maybe a bit too unstable to do so, to be brought back, and sometimes the code delta in the release lines is just too large that we can't feasibly bring that feature back at all. And if you're ever curious when the next release is, the release working group has draft schedules in their repository. They're very much subject to change. And sometimes when security releases happen, we have to shift the schedules around. And both the timeline on the previous slide and these issues can be found in the release working group repository, which is github.com node.js/release. And also, as a reminder, Node.js 16 is coming soon. So 20th of April 2021, Node 16 will be released, and it will be promoted to long-term support in October as an even-numbered release line. And you can even take a look and try out the release candidates of it. I'll try and share those in the chat later. And you can expect a release announcement on the day from the OpenJS and Node projects to announce some of the new features on the new release. And with the out with the old, in with the new, just a reminder that Node 10 will go end of life at the end of April. So if you're still stuck on Node 10, now's a good time to start moving up, because after April, you won't receive any security updates or patches.
Right, so before we dive into some of the new interesting features, one of the things I often think about or get a few questions are like, why do major releases seem so boring? A lot of projects sort of batch up all of their features, and so when you get to a major release, it's like, hey, it's the first time you get to see or access or use a bunch of those new features, and it's kind of like a big event as part of the release. The thing is, for the Node project, in our case, a lot of the interesting releases are Semver minor. We try to work very hard to sort of limit our Semver major changes, even though we do have a new Semver major every 6 months. And even when we do have Semver majors, often they're Semver major out of abundance of caution, in that they could break people, but it's actually very unlikely that most people are going to run into that. So the actual Semver major things, which are the things that are limited to be in those new releases, are not necessarily the interesting things. The interesting features, which are often minor, are already flowed back into earlier releases. And so by the time we get to a major, a lot of the interesting features may be like old news if you sort of think of it in the traditional way. But for my mind, it's still a great time when we have a new release to talk about all of the interesting features which have sort of come out or become available or are now available LTS, so in a supported way versus experimental or in a release that's not going to get long-term support. So it's a good time to talk about all the more recent interesting features versus strictly what's just in the release itself. So now let's move on to looking at what some of these new features are that we think you'll be interested in, some of the ones that we've picked out as our favorites. The first one I want to touch on is async local storage. It's very important for things like APMs or applications that try and track a transaction as it goes through multiple components. And Node being a platform where we often build with microservices, it's important to be able to sort of track the flow of a request as it goes across those microservices so that we can figure out what's going on if something goes wrong. Even though Node has been asynchronous from the very beginning, it hasn't built in a way to be able to maintain context across the different asynchronous calls. There have been some very good, third-party packages, but they definitely had to use things like monkey patching and so forth, which were maybe a little bit harder to keep up to date. And often there was also the case where we needed packages to make changes to support the asynchronous context propagation. But because it wasn't built into the runtime, it was a little bit harder to convince them that they needed to do that. So I'm very excited that we've got this async local feature in the current releases. It's still experimental, although there is a PR to move key parts to stable. And it sort of brings us on par with some other languages that have an easier time. So other languages which were more thread-based, like Java or even C, where a thread is doing a single context of execution, is a lot easier. There's things like thread local and other ways where you just stick information into the thread itself. In our case, we needed something quite different. If we take a little bit at the code, I don't have time to dive into all of the details, but this example, I think, is actually a good example to convince yourself why you need and answer a number of the key questions. Like, so for example, in this example, I actually show the flow ID, which is what I'm trying to show being passed across each of the contexts, by just using it as a parameter that's passed in, and it's in the Lambda. Well, that's often not possible. So even though I can do it in this example, you can't do that, but it's a good way to show you what the flow ID should be. The next question is, well, if your async local storage, which we see on the second line, is basically a global that everybody has access to, how is that different than just defining a global variable, which is that third line, the let shared flow ID? The key thing is that the async local storage.getStore gives you a unique value for your particular asynchronous context. And so if you have multiple asynchronous contexts, you'll still get the right answer. Whereas if you had that global variable shared flow ID, it actually just has the last one that was written. And if you run this example and sort of take a little bit of the code, you'll see that just doing the global variable gives you the wrong answer, whereas using the async local storage. So I suggest you go and take a look at it and sort of go through the different flows, because I think it helps to explain the key elements there. The next new content that I want to talk about is source maps. And this is around the problems of, in JavaScript, it's quite common where we write in one flavor, but we run in JavaScript. So people use transpilers to use a different version of JavaScript than is currently supported by, say, their Node runtime. People write code in TypeScript. And so we have a difference between the code that we've written and the code that we're running. This causes us problems for observability. In terms of, if I get a stack trace, it tells me, and we'll see that in the example, like it tells me a line number that doesn't even exist in my source code. We don't get good values for code coverage because you can't necessarily tell which lines of your actual source code. But luckily, people have come up with a solution to this. It's called source map v3. And what it does is it provides some metadata that sort of maps between the code you wrote and the code that's running. And you can see that, the source maps have been added by this sort of special comment, usually at the end of a file, that tells us where to get the source map information. So what support does Node.js have so far? So, back in 12, an environment was added to turn on source maps for code coverage, so that if you're using the V8 code coverage functionality, you can get better code coverage. An enable source maps option was also added in V12, and it's been worked on since then to enable things like stack traces and so forth to give you some more additional information. And finally, more recently, there's even a public API that you can use to get some of that source map information. A lot of this work's been done by Ben Coe, and he's got a great blog post if you want to read a little bit more in detail on that. Just a very quick look at what it looks like in practice. Very simple code on the right-hand side that just throws an error. The interesting thing, if we look on the right-hand side, having translated this using Babel, it tells me that, hey, my exception was thrown on, it triggered, in the stack trace to see line 9, which doesn't even exist in the file, and then line 6, where it's just blank. So that's what I get in terms of, without source maps. If I turn on enable source maps, with the same code, you can now see I get an extra line that tells me, oh, well, okay, that actually maps to, I created my class on line 7 and I threw my exception on line 3. So I think this shows why it's much better when you have the source maps enabled. There's still work to sort of fill out everywhere in Node where, source maps are useful. But, I hope that'll happen over time, but it's already something that you can use if you're in those situations.
So one of the other big news features, I'd say, in Node over the past couple of years has been the ECMAScript modules implementation. So as you may know, Node.js originally had the common JS module system, and then soon after the ECMAScript modules specification was kind of standardized. So there was a big effort done by the modules team and working group to bring this implementation to Node. So at a high level, just in these two examples, very briefly, we go from using module.exports to using the export and import syntax. And the modules working group had a big investment on the kind of ergonomics of using this, especially where we have both standards, so to speak, to take care of. So things like allowing you to specify in your package JSON your type modules so that you can import an ESM module with the .js extension. So as you may or may not be aware, the ECMAScript modules implementation is now stable in Node.js 15, and I believe just yesterday was marked stable in Node 12, and will be marked stable in 14, probably in the next release. So the implementation has come a long way, and we're finally at the point that it can be stable in almost all of the maintained supported release lines. But there are still a few APIs that fall under ECMAScript modules implementation that are still experimental. And these include the loaders API. So what this would do is allow you to customize the module resolution via some loader hooks. So in this example, we just passed the experimental loader with the loader implementation, and then the module wish to load. And this will only customize the loading of the ECMAScript modules. It won't touch anything to do with CommonJS. And then we have the JSON modules. So this allows you, like you would with require, to import a JSON file with the import syntax. This is still experimental. I believe it will stay that way for a little bit longer. There's still some consensus that needs to be reached. But for now, there is an alternative API that you can use, module.create required to kind of simulate this. And in a similar vein, we have WASM modules, and these allow you to import WASM modules using the import syntax. And probably one of the most anticipated features under the ECMAScript modules implementation is top-level await. So this allows you to use the await keyword at the top level, outside of an async function, within ECMAScript modules only. So the ECMAScript module can await a resource, causing other modules who import that module to have to wait until that activity is done before they start evaluating the rest of the body. And what are the use cases for this? So these use cases are kind of taken from the TC39 proposal that this feature went through the proposal process. So the first is dynamic dependency pathing, so you may not know until at runtime which path you wish to import. Another use case is resource initialization, so you may want to await while some task happens. For example, in this example, we've got DB connect setup of a DB connector that we're waiting on. And then there's also dependency fallbacks. So try to import X. If that fails, then import Y. And because some of these are still experimental, some are still hidden behind flags, so you would need to pass a flag to your node process to use these. And another recent new addition is the timers promises API. So this promisified timers API provides an alternative set of timer functions that return promise objects instead of the original callback interface. So you can use it by import from timers/promises, and you can do cool things like await a set timeout. So this is in Node 15. And what about fetch? Over to Joe to talk about fetch.
Yeah, thanks. We've been talking about new features and exciting stuff in Node, and when we first started putting this talk together, there was a lot of chatter about fetch. We thought we should definitely talk about it. Luckily, James gave a bunch of detail in his talk earlier today, so I highly recommend you go back and check that out later on. But like in summary, the gist is that fetch is a lot of work, and that includes a lot of underlying work that needs to be done. Fortunately, some of it is already implemented and in process, as James was talking about earlier, things like blob and URL and such. The good news is that fetch is being planned, it's being worked on, and the hope is that it will be implemented before the end of the year. So fingers crossed on fetch coming to Node soon. Moving on, I just wanted to quickly touch on the OpenJS Foundation, which is where the Node project is, as well as a number of other great projects. I think we have a little over 30 projects at the foundation. As we mentioned in the beginning, Michael and I are deeply involved in the foundation work there. Singular place for JavaScript as a home. JavaScript and beyond. Michael introduced the concept of open collaboration spaces, which is getting some traction. Really great place for people inside and outside of the foundation to collaborate on different initiatives and projects and such. And we recently introduced JSlandia, which is the individual membership program, which is really great. I think we have over 250 members now. So definitely come and collaborate with us in the foundation. If you go to openjsf.org/collaborate, you'll find a number of helpful resources, the calendar and the Slack inviter. And in Slack, we have a number of channels there, including some Node.js specific channels where we communicate and get some work done there. And speaking of collaborating and getting involved in the Node.js space particularly, there are a number of ways that you can get involved. Node2Do.org has been around for a while and is a great place to kind of walk through just getting started and getting build up and running and some good first issues and such. The triager role was introduced not too long ago, and that's a great place to help out and keep the project moving forward, dealing with issues and PRs and whatnot. Build helper is another role if you're more involved in Node and the build space particularly. We could use some help there. A new role I think that's being built out. And then like Beth was talking about earlier, there are lots of working groups, teams, and initiatives. There are a number of them listed here. But that's what I recommend for folks if they have the time to invest and get involved. Try to find an area that you're really interested in. The Node space works primarily out in the open on GitHub and with open meetings that are streamed and accessible. So definitely find your area of interest, start to observe, get involved. You'll find most people there are really welcoming and happy to have you there and help you to get going. So definitely check that out. And as I mentioned before, you can find us on Slack, OpenJS Slack, the Node Slackers space as well. IRC is still absolutely active and a lot of activity there as well. So if you want to help to figure out what's next in Node, definitely get involved. It is what you make it. Come and help us make it together. We want your participation. And in fact, as was mentioned earlier, we have the next 10 working group happening, the work happening. There's a survey link there. If you look on the Node.js handle, you can find some more resources around that, as were shared earlier, the blog and the repo. So definitely, help us move things forward. Thanks for hanging out with us. Thanks, Beth. Thanks, Michael. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.